Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and over the next half hour, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators. We'll get to those questions in just a bit, but I want to thank everybody who's taken the time to watch us over the first 200 episodes of our SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's been a pleasure being a part of your international edification, and we look forward to sharing our opinions and thoughts and ideas on where you can be taking your international education strategies at your institutions and how the world's events affect what we do every day. So as we do each week, we take our newsletter content that comes out on Mondays at 9 a.m. Eastern. And for those of you not familiar, we have a newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, which next week, coincidentally, will be celebrating its 200th edition. It's our weekly attempt to share our thoughts on top social media news as well as international education news in our industry. And those two combinations, social media and international education, that's the SMIE of SMIE Consulting, social media and international ed consulting. So with this newsletter, we give you a couple of different ways that you can subscribe. I've dropped the link to the website for our smieconsulting.org/subscribe opportunity to subscribe to that. You can also, we're going to drop the link to the most recent edition, so if you haven't yet gotten it, you'll be able to go follow along with us today if you're watching on Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, you'll get the links in the comments section as we're going along live. That will have all the relevant content that you need. But you can also subscribe through our LinkedIn version of our newsletter. Just drop the link to that as well in the chat. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, if you go to these articles come out on Mondays around 8:30, 9 a.m. in the morning Eastern time, and then you can just drop in the links or drop in your details to subscribe. Either click the button on the LinkedIn version or the online version for the newsletter site from our website. So happy to talk to you today about 3 issues that I think are very timely in this cycle that we've entered. A new academic year has begun on most American campuses, with a few just coming up in the next week or two. But the first story we're going to talk about today, or question we're going to ask today, is what do international students need on campus at this point in the history of international education in our countries? We're coming out of a pandemic, a global pandemic that has really challenged and stretched international offices and campuses around the country, around the world, has fundamentally changed the way we conduct education in a lot of ways on our university campuses, in terms of how classes are taught, where they are taught, the sizes that they're taught in, and whether they're online or in person. All of these have been affected by the pandemic. But we talk about our campuses as being affected. Our students have been dramatically impacted by what COVID-19 has brought to this world and how it has impacted what we do, what they do every day of their lives. So when we talk about what do international students need on campus, it goes beyond just what we used to talk about, and that was a strong orientation program that covered all the basics on immigration, on health insurance, on academic integrity, to much larger issues of mental health care and student well-being, and how our campuses can assess and take care of students that might be coming from countries where, frankly, the topics of mental health are not ones that have been freely discussed, maybe not even to this day with the pandemic. So we're looking at a couple different articles today that are relevant for what this topic is talking about, the issues of what do our international students need. First is from University World News, and this covers kind of a very appropriate post-pandemic look at how, from a macro scale, how things have changed. And it's a University World News post where it talks about the roller coaster ride for international students of the last couple of years, the anxiety and uncertainty about the future with the pandemic, regulatory battles, and global economic recession, all of these things that have impacted students' attempts to study outside their home countries. And it also focuses on what we all know all too well, how much China and India dominate the outbound student markets. For most countries, they're number 1 and number 2, maybe in reverse order in some countries, but those two certainly make up the lion's share international student populations in the U.S., U.K., Canada, Australia, other kind of major destination markets. So we look at what institutions need to do, even for these larger populations that probably have better support structures in place, maybe not from the institution themselves, but from Indian student associations, Chinese student associations. Maybe there's an extended diaspora community for Indian immigrants and Chinese immigrants to your region, to your cities, that might be able to provide a larger support network. But you think about it, even those students would need additional support on campus because of the issues that the pandemic has brought up in their lives. And in terms of what attracting and retaining international students should be top of the list of not only just bringing them in, but taking care of them once they're on campus. Because if you're not doing that well, you're really failing as an institution. And that will likely backfire all of the positive impact you might have had bringing students in by getting them in the doors, convincing them you have everything that they need. And then if the reality turns out to be far from it, then the negative implications to your institution can be quite significant. So having that balance between strong recruitment and strong services on the back end to take care of those students and address things like the well-being quotient that talks about things beyond scholarships and academic help. It's talking about a sense of belonging, frankly, in a very different environment to what they're used to. That a lack of that inclusion or that belonging can make them feel, frankly, mentally and emotionally vulnerable, as this article points out. And they look for, students look for systemic, as the article says, systemic inclusion and integration, both socially as well as through technology. So, as I mentioned, there may be some student support groups or student organizations that can provide that social support for them, but the mental health and well-being of those students outside of the classroom is inside and outside the classroom is something, while they're living on campus or in the area around campus, institutions certainly need to be paying a higher attention to. And that's certainly something that I believe most institutions have realized, the need for stronger mental health services, not just for their domestic students, but also for their international students. But there are, as I said, additional challenges with mental health that in addressing those concerns that students from many cultures that come to the United States are not coming from places that really even recognize mental health concerns or disease as a reality, and that's something that takes some getting used to, takes some education, takes some familiar faces to help convince them that yes, it's okay to go talk to someone about challenges you might be having, not just tuck everything away and suppress everything that you're feeling that might be negatively impacting what you do as a student. So there's a lot that's happening here and has happened on campus to, I think, start to address these issues. But the problem are these cultural barriers and a lack of awareness of what's going on and the availability and accessibility of support services in this respect. So it kind of adds to the ongoing challenges that we have, and we talked about this last week. How do you solve a problem like orientation? We all know in international orientation that we almost always, to a fault, over communicate and oftentimes oversaturate the new international students and with the rules and regulations and everything else we're trying to tell them about their campus experience that they need to know to do well. And some of that is need to know, some of that is want to know. So it's a matter of prioritizing, as we talked about last time, beyond those initial three things: immigration regulations, health insurance, and academic regulations. Beyond those three that you must have, what are the next most important things that need to be covered? And how do you cover them? When do you cover them? Do you do it all in the orientation week? Hopefully not. Hopefully you can cover some of the more obvious chunks beforehand and some of the less obvious chunks and maybe future-oriented chunks after they are enrolled, after they've gone through orientation, once they're settled in classes through ongoing orientation options. So how does that happen? We've seen cases of the rise of pre-departure orientations, where you try and fill as much of your students' arrival months, weeks, and months before they get to campus with content that they can assimilate and kind of prepare themselves for. Most of that might be around the academic coursework, around logistics of getting to campus, those types of things. But you also need to know other impacts that you can maybe deploy afterwards, after they've arrived, and following up with programs and the communication to the student community, new student community especially, about mental health, about well-being. But you can touch on those issues as early as the pre-departure orientations, just to let them know that, hey, if something happens, we want you to know, and something's not feeling right, we want you to know we have services in place to take care of you. And this may also be something you want to begin laying the seeds for with parents, especially for undergraduates, talking about the kinds of services and what that looks like on campus, and how that maybe involving some of your current parents of students who have maybe gone through some of these issues. You can maybe speak to some of the cultural taboos and their fears about, and then the realities of what their child experienced once they were enrolled. And had service from the university. So that's a great point in this University News, World News article, talking about those logistical barriers and the pre-departure orientations. But I also want to turn to a piece from, it was actually part of a podcast that my good friend Rajika Bhandari, who I've worked with in the past at IAE, and who's now been out on her own as a successful published author and has her own podcast as well. Always recommend that. It's America Calling, take on intersections of education, culture, and migration. That's her podcast, and then her book, America Calling, A Foreign Student in a Country of Possibilities, kind of documents her journey as an international student coming to the United States from India, and how she's immigrated to the United States after she finished her studies. So she has prepared in her, for one of her recent editions, a blog post that accompanies it that she calls, What Does It Take to Succeed as an International Student? And these are 5 things that she's developed from her own experiences and her work in international education over the past 20 years, getting a sense of what's really needed in the field for students to feel comfortable. So these are things that we've all dealt with in international student orientation. So what's here should not necessarily be a surprise to as an international student advisor, international missions person. These are things you talk about, but it's also good reminders for ourselves when we're approaching the topics of international student care, as to the kind of a mini checklist of things we need to be making sure that we're accommodating in our orientation, in our communications, in pre-departure, and on arrival as well. First up is be prepared for different classroom culture. Really spells it out pretty clearly in terms of, we talk about this. She asked the question, how many of you squirm at the thought of calling your professors by their first names, or raising your hand in class, or even asking a question of your professor? That's the reality that for most students, when they come to the U.S. higher ed system, the academic environment is radically different from what they're used to. And we know this if we've been in international ed for a while, but those reminders are always helpful to get that from a former international student perspective and how they overcame those challenges. So it's a matter of orienting yourself to looking through the experience from a new student's eyes. And if you can do that, you really, I think, are putting yourself at an advantage in being able to talk with those students about some of the concerns they're probably going to have that you want to kind of maybe preemptively discuss, and how they can get over these issues. Second topic she covers is prepare to experiment with your learning. So that's talking about changing your study habits, where in most countries, if it's a rote memorization in terms of how you basically take notes of everything the professor says in the class, and then you try and regurgitate that on a final exam. Don't expect that in the United States. That it's going to be very different. There'll be various ways you'll be examined throughout the year, throughout the course of an academic term, through quizzes, through tests, through papers, through classroom participation, and how important that is. She also makes the point about scholarships are there, but students will have to dig for them. program. That's, we all have maybe our merit scholarships that initial students can qualify for, but there's always going to be these small department scholarships that students might not hear about or know about until after they've gotten on campus. So it's about casting that wide of a net to find out what's out there, but educating students on what that process looks like once they're in the country. And it's also sharing with your future students or your incoming students, your new students once they've arrived on campus, that making sure that they know that, remember that they're coming to the United States for more than just an academic opportunity, that it's really about a life experience, a cultural experience, a work and life experience that they're not going to get anywhere else. It's going to be very uniquely American. With the classroom experiences they're going to have with the U.S. students, with other international students, with the professors that are going to become their mentors, that help them grow as budding professionals in their field. So that is all about the life beyond the classroom aspect of what we talk about in American international education, is that coming to the United States, doing well in classrooms is great, but if that's all you do is get a good grade and not really get involved on campus, not really explore activities, explore the area that you're living in, get to know your community, get to know other U.S. students, if you don't take advantage of that out of classroom time to really maximize your education, you've missed out on more than half of what the U.S. higher ed education system has to offer. So that's why I think it's more than just an academic opportunity, and reinforcing that message. And that final piece is, this is your chance to become a global citizen. And that's, I think, more than anything else, we see that in our role. We've talked about what it means to become countries that have these global visions for their countries, that U.S. wants to practice public diplomacy and educate future world leaders, not only to improve the economy of the United States, but improve our relations with other countries. And that's that education that these international students get on our college campuses helps them become those global citizens, more aware of the world around them. And that's something we hope for all of our students, domestic or international. So Rajika obviously makes some excellent points here in that answering that question of what do international students need on campus. Now, moving on to our second question. This is one that is constantly on the minds of international recruiters, international admissions people, not only in the United States but around the world. And that is, how can we unlock or make ground in Africa? We know that there are countries that have been doing particularly well in Africa for years. Obviously, former colonial ties for the British, for the French universities have helped them have significant footholds on the continent. We've seen the U.S. having done well without really intentionally going after the African market, outside of a few elite institutions that have bandwidth and funding to continually invest time and effort and resources in traveling to recruit in Africa. Over the past decade or more, you always see reports of Africa as the next major destination or source region for international students, and that's true. It is the continent with the fastest growing youth population under 25 in the globe, around the globe. So that is an area that all internationally minded institutions that are looking to grow beyond India and China need to be looking and developing strategies that might work in this region. Now, how that happens, it will vary from institution to institution, but what we're basing this article, this question on, is a piece from our friends at intl. That they talk about when traditional markets weaken, look to Africa. It's a two-part series. Part one was out last week, and part two just came out today. It focuses on 7 key markets: Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia, and Morocco, Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa. Now, those are the top sending countries to the United States and the top growing kind of population areas that are seem to be good markets for the United States. So they define it these best markets on the continent by 3 criteria: growing youth population, rising incomes, and employment opportunities for returning graduates. And then we got to keep in mind that student visa, as it stands now, is a non-immigrant student visa, even though there are possibilities for students to stay in the country and work and potentially get a work visa after they're done with their OPT. That's not always a guarantee, and for an 18-year-old that might be coming to the United States for the first time, that can't be their intention to stay in the country, at least their spoken intention when they go for their visa interviews. So having those employment opportunities for returning students is increasingly important for them to qualify for those initial visas. So that there are employment opportunities that are abounding in certain markets that are very attractive for returning students. So that's encouraging them to take that step and take that risk to go abroad for their degree and come back. Just had a conversation or hearing about a conversation with an alumni of an institution I'm working with now that's a successful alum who came to our institution on initially a track scholarship, finished her bachelor's degree, finished her master's degree as well, and is now working for an athletic shoe company and kind of building on what she learned as a student on our campus with her undergraduate and graduate degrees in kinesiology and exercise science, and how that's developed along with her track interests to become successful in what she's doing now with her work for a U.S. shoe manufacturer, athletic shoe manufacturer. So she's got a great story coming from not one of these 7 markets, but from Zimbabwe, talking about her experiences on campus and how that led to getting her degree program and the job afterwards. But those employment opportunities, she got a job in the U.S., but those in her country, they might not exist, but in other regions, other countries in Africa, they certainly would if she chose to return. Now, what's important about African nations here, that, as I mentioned, there's a pretty significant competition out there for these markets, for these students in these markets. We've seen, I mentioned the UK, I mentioned France having colonial ties that they're still pulling significant numbers of students from. In fact, if you look at for English-speaking destinations, and this is the odd one, the #1 English-speaking destination or English-speaking university programs that are drawing African students away is China. China is the largest source, enrolls the largest number of African students for English-speaking programs in China, followed by the UK and US. US and UK, depending on which way you're looking at it, which year. So we see significant competition. We see institutions from the Middle East also start to attract students from Africa to their programs. In the Gulf. So there's a recognition on a lot of countries around the world that Africa is a market that you need to have a presence in, that you need to be growing in, and it can be represent a significant source and diversification of your international student populations on your campus. So they in their 2-part series, part 1 today, and next week's I'll link to the Part 2 edition in the newsletter. Probably won't cover it during the chat next Wednesday, but they cover these 7 countries in depth. Really give you some great data from Brookings, from the United Nations, from a few other resources that share kind of the insights into why these countries have that growing middle class that's necessary to potentially afford a U.S. higher education, that have the returning opportunities for jobs when they get back. So you really see that these countries should rise quickly to the tops of your list. So part 1 addresses Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana, the 3 top markets. Then in the next article, we'll talk about South Africa, Morocco, and Tanzania and Ethiopia. So those are the 7 countries that they'll be covering in the series. So well worth a look. I definitely encourage you all to take some time and have a look at these as to why they should be on your radar. And certainly Africa is going to be on our radar for institutions. I'm working with the Education USA Regional Forum for Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, is going to be taking place in the spring of 2023. Not sure where that's going to be yet, but that's certainly one if you're looking to get engaged in Africa and at the top level and kind of figure out get the lay of the land, where some countries are that might be good fits for your institution. That's a place to start. With that EdUSA Regional Forum. But definitely read these 2 articles from INTED that have just come out in the last few days. And that'll be a good starter point for you if you're not already getting active in the African market. Now, our final question of the day. It's one that's truth in advertising. I used to work for IDP Connect that does higher ed consulting work for U.S. institutions and recruitment services. So one of my institutions, we currently work with them as well, with IDP. And the article, or the question is IDP's revenue growth a surprise? And if you saw the news in the Pi News last week, IDP posted a 50% growth in revenues year on year in fiscal year 22, with student placements expanding, really booming in this past year, and with rebounding in IELTS testers. Now, one of the reasons, obviously during the pandemic, IELTS was not a test that the testing centers were closed, and they had to do an IELTS at home version, or IELTS indicator test, and that was an online version of it, was not as hugely embraced as a replacement for the academic IELTS, but certainly one that a number of institutions did accept as a kind of pandemic-related measure alternative for students who couldn't take the academic English in a test center. So one of the other reasons IDP has seen a strong rebound in IELTS is that they now are responsible for all IELTS examinations in India, which for those that have been following the news in the last year or two, British Council gave up its stake in IELTS test centers in India to IDP, and IDP, British Council, and Cambridge English are co-owners of the IDP exam, or the IELTS exam. So up until the last 2 years, UK and Australian version, or British Council and IDP were both offering IELTS exam in India. So that's changed now. It's now just IDP that offers IELTS in India. So having the full share of the Indian market certainly has helped them rebound as well. So you think about just looking at the numbers from this IELTS or this IDP article. They had now record revenue of $793 million for final fiscal year 22. Which ended in June. So we look at what that meant for IDP. This is a company that started in the mid-'80s, working for Australian universities, and then as their agents. They've also, IDP, as I mentioned, are co-owners of the IELTS exam. So they have two very strong pieces of that, of the agent piece and also the testing piece, but they've also expanded to the lead generation side through their initial acquisition of Hot Courses about 6 or 7 years ago to now what they call IDP Connect, which provides lead generation service through I think 14 different global Hot Courses or Hot Courses branded sites that are also can be multilingual or are offered in native language for 10 or 11 different languages worldwide. That's a piece of the business that obviously has grown significantly to attract more institutional buy-in. Those institutions that buy into the lead gen services do not always also buy into the agent side of IDP. So there's different revenue streams that they have from institutions, from student placements, from lead generation services, and then from IELTS test exams. So they really have a fairly broad assortment of pieces of the pie, international student enrollment pie, that have expanded their revenue base considerably by 50% in the past year. So we're talking about, obviously, the company that is probably, if this continues, obviously it might be a few years before they get there, but if it continues, you were looking at potentially the first $1 billion revenue per year company in international education. So that will be maybe a topic down the road that we'll cover again in terms of what that looks like, perhaps after the agent aggregators have a few years under their belt, and we'll see what they look like in the coming years in terms of their overall revenue. But a lot to talk about in the field of international ed tech. We've seen the billions that have been, or the millions that have been thrown into venture capital funding for a lot of these unicorn ed tech companies over the last 4 or 5 years, and that may very well continue. But the track record certainly shows that the IDP, one of the biggest and longest standing international ed businesses out there, is still the biggest, and probably will be for the foreseeable future. But see if anyone can challenge them for that title. But we see a very crowded field in the service provider sector of international education, one that there'll be probably future consolidation in the coming years. With all these ed techs that have been popping up, there's already talk of some of them consolidating, but we'll see what happens. But we do, as we do each week, we thank you for joining us for these live chats, and we hope that you find the content usable for you in what you do at your institutions in international education. And until we see you again, either next week or in a future conference down the road, have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers.